Good morning. I want to welcome you to the workshop on intersectionality. This is part one. We're going to be led today by Courtney Rose. Courtney is a soldier of the Mayfair Community Church in Chicago and the Young Adult Ministries Director for the Metro Division. She has studied and taught biblical studies and theology at Olivet Nazarene University, and she attended seminary at Catholic Theological Union. Courtney and her husband Justin are parents to Simeon and Miriam. She loves eating Chicago-style hot dogs and drinking Pepsi, but most importantly, Courtney is a lover of Jesus, a lover of the church, and a lover of God's creation.
Hello. I'm so honored and thankful to be here with you today. I just feel like this is such a beautiful opportunity for the church and for the Salvation Army, and I'm really, truly honored to be able to be teaching and encouraging you to become holier people by engaging these really difficult questions. So as we're thinking about intersectionality, I'm going to give you a lot of definitions today. But one of the things that I think that is important for you to know about me is that intersectionality has really helped me in my job. Intersectionality has helped me understand young adults more. So I am the Young Adult Ministry Director for the Metropolitan Division, and as I'm watching young adults function on the internet, as I'm talking to them, as I'm interacting with them in person, this issue of intersectionality is so important to them. They might not know the word intersectionality, but this is the world that they're existing in. This is the language that they're using. These are the issues that are important to them. And so this is kind of my introduction into intersectionality, was through watching young adults and paying attention to what they're saying and how they're saying it. I also have a little bit of background in intersectionality in feminism. As we'll see today, intersectionality is a part of the feminist movement. And so in some of my training in seminary in feminist theology and feminist biblical interpretation, I was introduced to the ideas of intersectionality, but I didn't really realize how they connected until the last year, that all of these ideas are coming together, and we're essentially trying to say the same thing. So before we begin, I do want to acknowledge the fact that I am a white woman. And intersectionality is a powerful subject that could be even more powerfully addressed by a person of color. A Black, Indigenous person of color would be able to give, I think, a stronger voice to this. So I want to acknowledge that I have some privilege as I'm coming to this topic. But today, I have tried to curate some voices from Black women specifically, who are going to give more insight into the topic of intersectionality, and we'll be able to hear their stories better. Another thing to know is that intersectionality is complicated, and it is complex, and it is really super messy. This is nitty-gritty ministry. It's a nitty-gritty idea. It is not clean. And so as we're going through and we're thinking about this topic, I want you to have an open hand and an open heart. There's going to be things that I present to you today that may be difficult, or you may not like it, or it might even be a little bit offensive to you because of the person who is saying it. But that's not my point. That's not my agenda to make you feel scared or frustrated. I don't have a political agenda here. This is a really critical concept. It's an academic concept. And so I want to encourage you to really lean in and focus and try to understand what is being said. Also, I'm probably going to say some words that you might not necessarily know what they mean. I learned a lot of words in learning about this topic, and so if you need to ask a question, we have a space available for you to ask questions. I won't be able to answer those questions until probably the end. Also, feel free to Google. Always Google things and see what the internet has to say and see if you can get some clarity on some of the words that I'm using. I will be trying to define some of the words I'm using if I feel like they're words that you might not necessarily know or might be a little bit jargony. Also, my goal for this session is that you come away with a firmer understanding of what intersectionality is, that you have some definitions, and so that you can engage this concept and engage the people in your ministry, in your family, and in your community. You're not going to know everything about intersectionality. This is truly just an introduction to it. Also, and more so tomorrow, I'm hoping that you're going to have just a few practical tools that you can take away from this, and that you will be able to integrate some concepts from intersectionality into your work. One more thing that I think is important for when we're discussing intersectionality, I think you have to work from the assumption and the acceptance that oppression is real, and that oppression of specific people groups is real. You also have to accept that oppression and systemic oppression is sinful. It is wrong, and it is something that goes against the heart of God. And another thing, I think salvationists are really going to latch on to this concept. It might sound scary, it might feel scary because it's something that is talked about in ways that we don't necessarily understand or we don't know how to engage properly. But I think that most of us are already using intersectionality as a tool. We just don't know that we're doing it. And I think that some of these concepts I'm going to present today, you're going to be like, I already do that, or my Corps officer does that. So I want to encourage you. I think that the Salvation Army is doing a lot of intersectional ministry, intersectional work, paying attention to systemic oppression already. I think that we've had our finger on the pulse of this for a very long time. But today, I'm going to just give you some language to help you understand exactly what it is, how it's being used, and how the world is talking about it, so you have a little bit more clarity on the language. Okay, before we get into actual definitions of intersectionality, I want to mention one more thing that the Lord put on my heart. And that is that as Christians, we are liberators. Last night I was thinking and preparing for this presentation, and God put this story on my heart and on my mind that I think is really helpful. In 2 Samuel 21, verses 1 through 14, there's a story of a woman named Rizpah. I wonder if you're familiar with her. Rizpah. She's kind of a story that gets overlooked because you often are like, what does this have to do with anything? But during Rizpah's story, we see that there had been a famine in the land for 3 years. David is the king. He is the successor of the kingdom after Saul. And after 3 years of famine, he finally goes to God and is like, what's going on, God? Why is there famine in the land? And God says, there has been an injustice done upon the Gibeonites. Now, the Gibeonites are a group of people who are kind of like the cousins of the Israelites. They're not really Israelites, but they're in treaty with the Israelites and kind of related to them. So in, but not out. And what had happened was that Saul went and basically slaughtered all of these Gibeonite people, even though they had assumed that they were safe with Saul. And so because this injustice had taken place, David goes to the Gibeonites and says, hey, this bad thing happened. Let's fix it. Let's rectify the situation. What would you like us to do? How can we fix this horrible injustice that has been done? How can we fix all of the deaths that have taken place in your community? The Gibeonites come back to David and they say, we want 7 of Saul's sons killed, and everything will be good. And so that's what they do. David takes 7 of Saul's sons and they slaughter them at the beginning of the barley harvest. You can imagine that they're kind of hoping that at the beginning of the barley harvest that some sort of sacrifice is going to make the rains come and the barley will be able to grow this year. And after they sacrifice these men, these 7 sons of Saul, they leave their bodies out in the wilderness. They just leave them there. Now, today we would never do that, right? Like even in our society, would never leave dead bodies out there, just in the wilderness, letting the elements take them or animals take them and eat them. It's so disgusting and dehumanizing. But you can imagine how important and how foreign it would have been to this culture to see these men strewn out, left for dead, with no burial, no ceremony, nothing to prove that they are human. And so this woman, Rizpah, comes onto the scene because it is her sons, some of her sons, who have been sacrificed. And so she says these bodies should have been buried. They should have been taken care of, but they're left out in the open. And so for months, she protects these dead bodies. And she cries and she wails and she puts on sackcloth. This woman who had once been the wife of Saul, the concubine of Saul, who had come from lofty places, is now out in the wilderness day and night, fending off wild animals, fending off the birds, watching her sons' bodies decompose. And finally, because of her wailing, because of this big spectacle she's making, somebody starts paying attention and says, oh, Saul's concubine is out in the field making a big deal about these dead bodies. And I should mention that the famine still hasn't ended. The famine continues on. They thought that sacrificing these men was going to fix the problem, but it doesn't. And so when David finally recognizes what's going on and says, oh, let's go check out why Saul's concubine is so upset, she goes and she basically says, like, you need to bury my son's bodies. You can't just expose them like this. This is dehumanizing. This is disgusting. And another thing that we should know is that this is an injustice that has been done upon Rizpah. Her sons are also the victims of Saul. Saul was not supposed to go and kill these men in Gibeah, but also her sons should not have to pay for the sins of their father Saul. That goes against the law, it goes against Torah. And so she is mourning essentially two accounts of injustice. And so only after David finally buries these bodies, takes the bodies of Saul and Jonathan, who'd just been like hung up on pikes in a different town, and buries them. Once the whole Saul episode has been taken care of, then the water comes. Then the rain comes, and famine ends in the land. The famine only ends when all the injustices are addressed. One of the things I love about Rizpah, and I think what the Lord really wants us to hear, is that Rizpah's name means hot stone. She burns hot. She fights out in the wilderness for her son's dead bodies. She's relentless. She does crazy things to get attention, and it finally works. I think that there are a lot of people in history who have had to reduce themselves to this form of getting attention because of the injustices that are going on around them. And many, many of them are women. They have no other voice, and so they use almost like a crazy antic to get attention. And it's not just an antic that this woman is doing. She's protecting her son's bodies. She is the only thing that they have left in this world. And so as I'm thinking about this story, I'm thinking about two things. First, you could be a Rizpah. You could be somebody who burns hot for justice. Or you can be like David, somebody who's kind of disengaged but has a lot of power to fix injustices. I wonder who you are. Are you somebody who's going to burn hot? Are you going to draw attention to big problems? Are you going to put yourself out there, maybe be embarrassed yourself because injustice is so dehumanizing and disgusting? Are you going to be like David, somebody who uses his power to actually engage and solve problems? We see that if David would have engaged in this issue earlier, the problem would have been solved earlier. But he kind of checked out. He didn't ask of the Lord. He didn't seek of the Lord. It took 3 years before he even started to address it. Some of you have positions of power, and you're not paying attention. You're not listening to what God is saying. You're not seeking of the Lord, but you are also not paying attention to the Rizpahs of the world. So I don't know who needs to hear that. Probably it was just for me. But I think it's something that we can learn from. So moving on, I'm going to move to the next slide. I'd like us to take a minute and look at these different socio-religious, socio-economic descriptors of identity And I'd like you to take just a couple of minutes to go through here and try to identify yourself. Earlier, I identified myself as a white woman. I am also cisgendered. I am hetero. I am a privileged person. I am Christian. I am lower middle class. It feels like that's slipping every day. I'm an educated woman. I'm a Christian woman. I live in a country that is a product of colonialism. I live in the Midwest of the United States. I am an able-bodied person. I do not have any disabilities. All of these things are a part of who I am. I wonder who you are. So I'd like you to look at this list here and for you to just take a minute to identify yourself. Identity plays an incredibly important role in understanding intersectionality. So take a couple minutes and just think about that. You might be somebody who has been watching young people online, maybe not necessarily even young, but you're seeing that people are starting to identify themselves with their pronouns, maybe in their profiles, like on Instagram or on Twitter, or maybe even in their email signature. You're seeing that they put she, her, hers, or his, him, or they, them, or maybe even something completely different. I'm not going to completely get into pronouns today, but I just want us to acknowledge that identity is an important part of who we of this concept and understanding ourselves. And if we can understand ourselves, it will help us be able to interact with other people in the world and start recognizing that we have differences. And it's okay for us to have differences. It's actually important for us to acknowledge those differences. So if we were here in person, I would have us all kind of share our different identity markers, and we'd be able to say, oh, that's so interesting that you're from this country, or or that this is where you grew up, or that this is how you identify yourself, that you may identify as a different gender than your sexuality, something like that. These are all important things, and it's important for you to engage it. Even if you don't necessarily understand it, please try to enter into the conversation, maybe start to identify with your own pronouns in different places. We'll kind of put a pin in those different identity markers and come back to them tomorrow. So let's move on to the next slide. Let's get into what intersectionality actually is. We've been talking about it for 15 minutes without actually saying what it is. So intersectionality is a term coined by law professor Kimberly Crenshaw in the 1980s to describe the way that multiple systems of oppression interact in the lives of those with multiple marginalized identities. Intersectionality looks at the relationship between multiple marginalized identities and allows us to analyze social problems more fully, shape more effective interventions, and promote more inclusive advocacy among communities. Now, here's an important distinction. Intersectionality is a critical lens and approach. It is not a collection of identities. Rather, it is an acknowledgement that one person can experience different types of discrimination that inform each other. One more definition. We should be talking about intersectionality in terms of what it does rather than what it is. It is a noun, but it is also a verb or an adjective. We look at things intersectionally. So I know that I just made you do an identity kind of inventory, a really quick one. But the fact of the matter is that identity plays a part into it, but it's not just this list of identities that you have. Like when I say I'm a white woman, cisgendered, heterosexual, that's part of my identity, but that's not intersectionality. That's just my identity. What we're going to see is that intersectionality is actually when my identities and another person's identities are different from each other, and then there's somebody in the middle who has sharing identities, and then there's no space for them in between. Why does intersectionality matter? I talked about this a little bit further. I gave a little mini sermon on Rizpah. But 3 things that we should think about is that Jesus sought out the marginalized and he healed intersectionally. He looked at people for their whole person, recognized their whole identity, and saw the different parts of them and how they conflicted or contributed to the suffering that they were experiencing. One example of this is in Matthew chapter 15 with the Syrophoenician woman. You might remember this story because she comes to Jesus and says, "Oh, Jesus, heal my daughter. She's sick," or she's possessed by a spirit, I believe she says. And then Jesus basically says, "I came for Israel, not for you guys." And she says, "Even the dogs get scraps from the master's table." And then Jesus is really pleased by that response. It's a really, really strange story. But what we see here is that this woman is suffering intersectionally because she is a woman, because she is a Gentile. Jesus initially disregards her, but then she presses in a little bit further and gets Jesus' attention. Another thing we should pay attention to is that justice is an important and foundational aspect of intersectionality. I'm not going to read While Women Weep or the I'll Fight for You, but you can understand that these are the things that we are fighting as the Salvation Army. And much of these issues of oppression are interlocking. They intersect with one another. We can't just fix women weeping by giving them Kleenex. We have to look at what is the underlying issue. And some of those underlying issues are very complicated and messy. Something to know about justice here is that intersectionality is the idea that all oppression is linked to one another. It's not a neat and tidy thing. It is a ball of mess that we have to untangle. And then as I mentioned previously, if we want to engage Gen Zers, if we want to engage the younger demographic of young adults that are coming up into the world, we must engage in intersectionality because they are doing it. We will lose an entire generation of people if we do not engage intersectionality. Justice, equality, identity, and intersectionality are the waters in which Gen Z swims. This is how they communicate. This is how they value things. We have to understand that. So, moving forward, next slide. The question is, what is intersectionality? Intersectionality actually developed as a legal theory. And that's where this gets tricky because it's a legal theory. It's a kind of an academic concept. It is also an analytic tool for critical inquiry. It's a tool, it's a method, it's a model, and a way in which we can look at the world, the way we can look at individuals and look at suffering and say, how can we untangle this? How can we make this clearer? Also, intersectionality can be used and can take many different forms. The way I might be talking about intersectionality might be a little bit different or nuanced than another person, especially if the conversation is happening on the internet. The way people talk about intersectionality in academic terms or in legal terms is going to be kind of long and more complicated. But when you have an 18-year-old expressing their identities or talking about different forms of oppression, they're going to be talking about intersectionality a little bit differently. Also, again, I want to emphasize that intersectionality is a critical praxis. This is something that can happen in everyday life. It's an academic concept, but it's also something that is just happening in the world around us. It only became a critical concept when somebody put it to words. She observed something that was happening in the world and gave language to it. But you are seeing intersectional oppression taking place in your core. You're seeing it take place in your communities, and it has been going on since the beginning of humanity. Intersectional oppression has been going on for a very long time. And also, another important thing to know about intersectionality is that it is a part of and also a critique of the feminist movement. So we'll get into that more. I'm going to have us watch a video clip from the movie Hidden Figures. If you haven't seen it, it's a really wonderful film. But in this video clip, we're going to see an example of intersectional oppression. So a great clip to show how this woman, Catherine, is facing multiple forms of oppression in the same space. Before we get into it, I do want to mention that while this clip is so helpful for us understanding intersectionality, we also have to acknowledge and call out the fact that we do have some white saviorism taking place. We have this white man who comes in and kind of fixes the problem. Like, it's so easy for him just to tear off the sticker and knock down the sign, and there, he's fixed the problem. And this is something that we see a lot in movies and in the world, that white people can just come in and solve the problem. And so we want to acknowledge that, that's taking place there. But in this video, we see that there's kind of three different forms of oppression taking place for Catherine. One is racism. She has a colored bathroom across the campus. She also has a separate pot of coffee. The second is that she has to wear a uniform of a skirt below the knee and heels that make it difficult for working and walking. Can you imagine a world like that, where the institution that you work for requires you to wear heels and a uniform skirt so you can't walk or work very well? Imagine. Also, we see economic oppression because she is not being paid as highly as the people around her. She can't even afford her full uniform, the pearls, because of her race and her gender. And so we have these three different areas of oppression converging together in one experience and in one person. So Hidden Figures, there's a lot of different great examples of intersectionality at play in that movie. I recommend you watch it and see if you can identify some of them. We're going to move into the next slide, and I want to give you just a few different definitions of identity markers that we are seeing more popularly used today. The first one is feminism. I'm going to talk about feminism a lot. Feminism is a movement and a theory for the economic, social, political, and religious equality, rights, and dignity of all women. It is focused on the struggle of women against domination, exploitation, oppression, and dehumanization. I think feminism is really important for us to understand, because if we become a truly feminist world, it would benefit all people. All people would be made better because of it. This is not just a female issue. This is not just a woman issue. This is an everybody issue. Another definition is for gender. Gender is either of the two sexes, male and female, especially when considered in reference to social and cultural differences rather than biological ones. The term is also used more broadly to denote a range of identities that do not correspond to established ideas of male or female. So, and if you did not know this, it is important for you to distinguish your gender from your sexuality. Your sexuality is your biological body, the parts that you were born with, versus gender is how you identify in the social constructs of gender. The next one, you're probably seeing this a lot on the internet, and it is BIPOC, B-I-P-O-C. This stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. It is used to highlight the unique relationship to whiteness that Indigenous and Black African American people have, and which shape the experiences of and relationship to white supremacy for all people of color within a U.S. context. It is now generally preferred that you use BIPOC rather than POC or people of color, because it is less general. It helps you identify more specifically who you're talking about. So that's how you pronounce it. It is BIPOC. Next one for definitions. We see oppression. Oppression is in one social group, whether knowingly or unknowingly, exploits another social group for its own benefit. That's the thing with oppression, is that sometimes we don't know we're doing it. And sometimes groups of people are being exploited or benefited on behalf, and it takes the place when other people are being exploited. Racism, then, is a system of unequal power and privilege and an ideology which holds that based on race, groups can be ranked hierarchically within regard to intelligence, ability, and so on, and may thus be discriminated against. Racial segregation is a fundamental organizing principle of racism, and racism can be exercised as institutional racism, scientific racism, everyday racism, and personal racism. It's all over the place. The next one is privilege, which is really important for us to understand in terms of intersectionality. Privilege is when certain social advantages, benefits, or degrees of prestige and respect that help an individual has by virtue of belonging to certain social identity groups. Within America and other Western societies, these privileged social identities of people who have historically occupied positions of dominance over others include white people, male, heterosexual, Christians, and the wealthy. There's also a whole other host of different people and social identities who are privileged, but those are kind of the big ones within our specific society who are holding power and often are oppressing, whether they know it or not. The next definition I want to share is queer. You might be seeing the word queer show up a lot, again, as you're interacting with people. And you might be familiar with the term queer in terms of its old definition, which was something is abnormal or strange. Historically, the word queer has been used as an epithet or slur against people whose gender or gender expression or sexuality don't conform to the dominant expectations of the society. Some people have reclaimed the word queer and self-identify as queer in opposition to assimilation. For some, the reclamation of the word queer is a celebration of not fitting into social norms. Not all people who identify as LGBTQIA, those are the different acronyms for the queer community, they use the word queer to identify themselves. So not all people who are in that community will identify as queer. The term is often considered hateful when it's used for people who are not identifying as LGBTQIA. So unless somebody gives you permission or they themselves identify as queer, you probably shouldn't call them a queer person. The next one is cisgendered. Now, cisgendered is a gender identity or a performance in a gender role that society deems to match with a person's assigned sex at birth. The prefix cis means on the other side, or not across. And it is a term used to highlight the privilege of people who are not transgender. For example, I am a cisgendered person. I have female anatomy and I identify as a female myself. And so that has given me privilege in the world because I am not transgender. I do not have the parts of the opposite sex. Now, finally, I want to clarify the word marginalize. To marginalize someone is to relegate someone to an unimportant or a powerless position within a society or group. And I think that that's an important distinction that we need to put on there, is that it relegates people. It takes away their power. That's not something that we want to be doing as Christians or as humans. We don't want to take power away from people. We want to give them power and help them to succeed in the world. So I've given you a lot to think about here in just a couple of these definitions. I want to give you another definition for intersectionality to help clarify all of these things that I've just said. All right? Now, this definition is a very critical definition. This is coming from the textbooks about intersectionality. Intersectionality investigates how intersecting power relations influence social relations across diverse societies, as well as individual experiences in everyday life. As an analytic tool, intersectionality views categories of race, class, gender, sexuality, nation, ability, ethnicity, and age, among others, as interrelated and mutually shaping one another. Intersectionality is a way of understanding and explaining complexity in the world, in people, and in human experiences. Let's explain that a little bit more in the next slide. That working definition describes intersectionality's core insight, namely that in a given society at a given time, power relations of race, class, and gender, for example, are not discrete and mutually exclusive identities, but rather build on each other and work together, and that while often invisible, these intersection power relations affect all aspects of the social world. So we have these ideas that we have these complex parts of all of who we are, and they can build on one another. They can build on how society views us can build on one another and make life very difficult for certain people. And often for most of us, we are experiencing things that are difficult because of how society defines them. Using intersectionality as an analytic tool can be helpful for us if we can look at the world and try to put on a lens of intersectionality. It can help us solve problems that are around us, or it can help us solve the problems that the people in our life are facing. On the next slide, you see a little different Venn diagram. And you can see how these different identities within a person, they all are intersecting. They're all interacting with each other. They don't always interact. They sometimes don't interact. But they all are contributing to the complexity of a person and how the complexity of that person interacts in the world. We are all not having the same experience in the world. We're all having different experiences. By using intersectionality as a tool, you can address multiple intersecting frameworks of oppression and address a wide range of social problems at the same time. We're going to watch a video clip. It's kind of a long one, but I think it's going to give you a lot of clarity on this topic, and also it's going to give us the perspectives of two Black women. So hopefully that video was helpful in clarifying to you about how intersectionality and feminism are connected. We're going to move and transition into a time where we're talking a little bit more about feminism so we can get a history of how intersectionality plays into all of this. So some key takeaways from that video that I want you to be paying attention to is that feminism historically had been marketed as having a white face. The women's rights movements of the 1960s was championed largely by white women for white women to get equal pay. I don't want to be completely reductionist about this. Of course, other women and women of color were participating in the women's rights movement, but largely it was for and on behalf of white women. But in order for those white women to go to work, women of color were the white women's child care worker or carers in the home. And so while white women were getting rights to work in the workplace, they were getting an opportunity to be paid more, Black women and other women of color were in the homes taking care of those white women's children. Many women of color did not find a place within this version of feminism. And so we see that a lot of women of color, BIPOC individuals, were feeling left out from the feminism movement. I want to move and talk about the 4 waves of feminism now, just as a really brief primer. We're not going to spend a ton of time on this, but I want you to notice that feminism has evolved over the years. In the Western world, feminism kind of began in the 1830s and moved through the early 1900s. This is something that the Salvation Army is really coming out of. This is where our egalitarianism finds its roots. And during this time, the fight was, in order for women to gain power, women must be able to vote. We also see an emphasis on temperance because it was kind of tempering the behavior of men so that women could also get into spaces and hold power. Abolition of slavery was also very important to this part of feminism. Property ownership is really important during this time because at the time, women weren't able to hold property, and the money that they had in their family would be passed on to other generations, and they could potentially be left destitute or not have any power to take care of themselves. Other economic issues were important at the time. By the time we get to the 1960s, we see that we're on the end of World War II and that we had these women who had been in the workplace, and then the men came home. Everyone started kind of a nuclear family, and everything started to settle. And so women started to fight for the right to work, to have equal pay. This is where we see reproductive rights being fought for, and anti-discrimination. Again, this is a very reductionist view of these different forms of feminism. I know that it is much more complicated and heated than this. By the time we get to the 1990s, this is where we have the introduction of the concept of intersectionality. If you remember, intersectionality began in the the word was described in the 1980s. We also, during this time, see wage disparity being addressed, again, reproductive rights being addressed. We also see a push for international feminism to start taking hold, and also an emphasis on violence against women, that there would be fighting against that. Bringing us to the present moment. Kind of in the last 5 years, we've seen us entering into what many consider to be a fourth wave of feminism. We see this with the #MeToo movement. We also see this with the glass ceiling breaking or the attempt for the glass ceiling to be broken in the workplace. We also see an emphasis on consent culture within sex, and also more sex positivity. I also put a question mark here because we are in the throes of, obviously, a global pandemic, and we are seeing that women are being disproportionately affected by the pandemic, and more particularly BIPOC women being affected by the pandemic because they are being pushed out of the workplace because they need to stay at home and work with their kids. They are being affected and getting sicker, and in many cases dying at higher rates than white male counterparts. So we don't know what the future of feminism looks like in this country because things are changing and kind of regressing pretty rapidly. I'm going to have us watch another video. I know that this video might be long, another one, but I do think that this is really helpful and important in clarifying where does the legal history of intersectionality come from. All right, so in that video, we see the explanation of these 3 different court cases with 3 different outcomes. And the way that she talks about it is that we have a single axis framework. And that framework treats race and gender as mutually exclusive categories of experience, that they don't intersect with each other. In so doing, such a framework implicitly privileges the perspective of the most privileged members of oppressed groups. So again, if you have a black man and a white woman, both in these oppressed situations, there's not a space for if you are both of them, if you are a woman and a black person. And so they need to intersect. But if you use a single axis framework, it separates them. Racial discrimination cases often focus on black men, and sex discrimination cases tend to focus on the white women. Crenshaw, argues that this narrow focus distorts our understanding of both sexism and racism. A black woman's experience with discrimination are only validated by how close her experience is to a white woman's or to a black man's, for example. And ultimately, Crenshaw argues that the elusive goals of any racism or patriarchy are made ever more complicated by the erasure of black women's unique experiences with both racism and sexism. They are experiencing both of them, and it is compounded upon them. So let's clarify this a little bit more. I have a collection of a thread of tweets on the next slide. And I'm using these tweets to help show you that this conversation about intersectionality is not just happening in the textbooks. It's not just happening in universities. It is happening in the world around you. All it takes is for you to get on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram and start to engage this topic and many other social justice topics. So we're going to see what Marie Beecham has to say about this, and I think she does some great clarifying. She writes, "You can and should combat multiple forms of oppression at once." This is a thread on intersectionality versus whataboutism. Intersectionality, coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in the 1980s, describes how our different social identities are related to interconnected, overlapping forms of oppression. An example, Black women experience misogynoir, which is a fusion of racial and gender discrimination. Whataboutism, term coined in the 70s, refers to using what about, insert topic that I would rather talk about. It's a method of discrediting someone's argument by asserting that a different issue is more important. An example is Black Lives Matter. Well, what about white lives? Intersectionality adds attention to interconnected issues and seeks to unite multiple fights without taking away from any one cause. Whataboutism detracts from whatever issue you're discussing, creating an imaginary hierarchy in which only one issue can take the top spot. Intersectionality and whataboutism are similar in that they both involve bringing up other issues. While they feel different, the distinction between the two is highly subjective, and it is greatly influenced by your perception of how important an issue is. Like MLK said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Systems of oppression are interconnected, so combating any mode of oppression is helpful and good. TLDR, oppose and combat multiple forms of oppression at once. Our causes aren't competing. We're united in the fight for equity. So that brings us to what are the 6 core ideas of intersectionality? This is coming from a book by Collins and Bilge. It's called Intersectionality. I really recommend it. If you are really jazzed about this idea and you really want to get into some academic reading about intersectionality, this is a great textbook to help you. In this book, they actually use 3 different case studies to help define how intersectionality works in the world. Because again, I want to emphasize that intersectionality is about people, it's about experiences, and it's messy. It's not cut and dry. I can give definitions all day long, but the reality is you have to look at people's experiences and try to understand their perspective. Intersectionality and understanding intersectionality requires a great amount of empathy and listening. So as we go in, the first one that I want to talk about is social inequality. Examples of this would be racism, sexism, class exploitation, poverty. These are social inequalities that people are feeling. And what they say in the book is that recognizing that social inequality is rarely caused by a single factor. Intersectionality adds additional layers of complexity to understanding the social inequality. Using intersectionality as an analytic tool moves beyond seeing social inequality through race-only or class-only lenses, and instead understands social inequality through the interactions among various categories of power. So what is this saying? That oppression is all linked, and that we can't just kind of separate ourselves into these different categories without recognizing that they interact with one another. The next one is power relations. So racism versus sexism, capitalism, and also heterosexism. There's domains of power. There's also structural, disciplinary, cultural, and interpersonal domains of power that people can hold. And so in the book, it talks about that the case of global social inequality shows how intersectional frameworks that take power relations into account, especially those that analyze how nation states hold power, work with different philosophies of social democracy and neoliberalism. This raises questions about global social inequality. So what we're saying here is that different power relations, not all power is the same. Different people and different groups hold power differently, but the way that they are enforcing power on individuals can cause oppression and cause different levels of complexity in how they are facing oppression. The next one is social context. This is kind of an easy one. Where do you live? What is the context around you? So, for example, perhaps you live in Brazil, perhaps you live in the global south, perhaps you live in a country that has a history of slavery, a history of colonization, you speak multiple languages there, you have indigenous and colonizing people put together in the same group. What is the milieu of your experience? Understand your social context. Relationality, then, is also incredibly important, and I think something that you will really understand with this. Relationality informs all aspects of intersectionality. Relationality embraces a both-and analytical framework that shifts focus from seeing categories as oppositional. For example, the differences between race and gender. So you don't separate them, you move to examining how are they interconnected to each other. Relationality takes various forms within intersectionality and is found in terms such as coalition, solidarity, dialogue, conversation, interaction, and transaction. I think we all do a lot of relationality when we're looking at the world around us. The next one is complexity. Intersectionality complicates things and can be a huge source of frustration for scholars, practitioners, and activists. Intersectional work is really hard. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of thinking and intentionality. Using intersectionality as an analytic tool is difficult precisely because intersectionality itself is multifaceted. Because intersectionality aims to understand and analyze the complexity in the world, it requires intricate strategies to do so. And again, I want to emphasize that intersectionality is not a neat, tidy thing that we're engaging. You can engage it academically, kind of like what I'm doing right now, but the reality is that it involves people, and people are messy, and people have very messy problems. And to compound that, oppression is so deeply hurtful that it makes problems even worse. So it's complex, it is hard, it is icky work, but it is something that we have to do. Social justice is the next one. What makes an intersectional project critical lies in its connection to social justice. You can't just be doing intersectional work and say, I'm not going to engage in social justice. Because if you are doing intersectional work, you are fixing things. You are solving problems. You are lifting oppression and liberating people. Social justice is elusive in unequal societies where the rules may seem fair, yet differently enforced through discriminatory practices. Social justice is also elusive where the rules themselves may appear to be equally applied to everyone, yet still produce unequal and unfair outcomes. We live in a society where things are unfair. Even if you feel like things are fair, the reality is that people are screaming, crying out and saying, no, it's not fair. Please pay attention to the fact that this isn't fair and it's not right. So we have to engage with social justice. We have to try to solve these messy, icky, deeply problematic issues. I'm going to give you 10 real quick tips for how to put intersectionality into practice. Tomorrow we're going to be looking a little bit more critically, and I'm going to be giving you some very specific tools, but I'm hoping that this will give you a quick context for how you can start living this out in your own life. And also, I think that you're going to see that you probably are already doing some of this work yourself. So the 10 tips are: recognize that there are multiple struggles, recognize that there are intersecting oppressions. You need to listen to people's voices. Focus on inclusivity. Focus on how different families are different. Pay attention to disaggregated data. Look at intersecting issues and cross issues. Focus on collaboration. Pay attention to people's health. And look at communities. Let me unpack that. The first one is that we need to acknowledge that there are many struggles in the world. An intersectional approach acknowledges systemic discrimination due to sexual orientation and identity, gender and gender inequality, identity, race, economic status, immigration status, national origin, and ability, among other aspects of one's identity, and that this systemic discrimination impacts access to opportunity. However, recognizing these multiple systemic barriers to opportunity and multiple forms of prejudice is only the first step in adopting an intersectional approach. So, first step, acknowledge that people are truly struggling. Pay attention to what they're saying. Step 2, intersecting oppressions. Appreciate that forms of systemic discrimination intersect with each other and present unique challenges for affected individuals and communities. You have to acknowledge it. You have to believe that oppression is real. The third one, maybe one of the most important ones, voice. Respect the voice of those most affected by issues by centering their voices, respecting their goals for their communities, and stepping aside and allowing them to serve as spokespeople for their own causes. I wonder if this is something that we do well in the Salvation Army. I think sometimes we do a great job of listening to people's voices, but by the nature of the Salvation Army, we like to go into a place and take over and say, here's the truth, here's the values that your community should have. Versus what this is suggesting is that maybe we should go in and listen. What do the people there need? How can we come alongside of them and help them reach their goals? For those of us who hold privilege and power, it is really hard for us not to foist our ideas and expectations upon other people. I mean, I do it all the time. I have to step back, humble myself, and listen to what other people are saying. This is a hard exercise for some of us, but it's something we must do. The next one is inclusivity. Be inclusive and incorporate different perspectives when talking about your issues. When speaking about issues, it is critical to recognize that there are multiple voices within a movement, that there is no singular way of experiencing an issue, and that various voices and perspectives need to be considered in order to make real, lasting, and equitable change. I think that we do want to make real, lasting, and equitable change, but again, the reality is that it is going to take a long time and deep intentionality to do that, and that means that we're going to have multiple voices, and sometimes conflicting voices come together in the same space, and that is hard, but it is what is necessary. We must be inclusive of even ideas that we don't like. Family. Acknowledge that individuals with intersectional identities may face unique challenges in how their families are perceived and in building and sustaining their families. For example, I come from a nuclear family. My family is a nuclear family, but there are many people in the world who are experiencing intersectional oppressions, and their reality is not a nuclear family, and that is okay. The nuclear family is not the end-all, be-all. There's a lot of forms and expressions of family, intergenerational. Sometimes grandma is raising kids, sometimes an aunt is raising kids, sometimes we have a foster family. All these different forms of family are valid. And many, many people who have these intersectional oppressive experiences come from families that are not nuclear. That does not mean that we need to force them to have a nuclear experience. It just says acknowledge that it's different and that it's okay. Then, disaggregated data. Ensure that data collection does not overlook the experiences of individuals with intersectional identities. Often data is unable to tell the story of communities that sit at the intersections because the data only focuses on singular aspects of their identity. Highlighting the importance of disaggregated data ensures that the experience of communities with intersectional identities are not missing and they can be uplifted. It protects the voices of those who are directly impacted by ensuring their unique experiences are recorded. Now, I'm not sure if all of you are involved in research and looking at data, but I know that we all have to deal with statistics in our jobs or in our core. So maybe a question we should be asking is the statistics that we're taking, are these statistics, are the things that we're reporting, is it actually reporting what's actually going on here? Are there people who are falling through the cracks? Are the statistics only painting one picture that are leaving out entire groups of people or not showing the experiences and the oppressions that many people in our congregations and our communities are facing? Next one is intersecting issues and cross issues. Be open to thinking creatively about social justice issues, assessing how issues connect with seemingly unrelated topics, and considering how they may have unintended consequences for different areas. This is an exciting one to me because it means that you can use this tool of intersectionality and you can look at a lot of different things and start saying, hey, is there oppression? Is there discrimination taking place in things that might not seem to be connected? It takes a creative eye and a trained eye to start seeing how all these things are connected together. Collaboration, then, is when we strive to collaborate with people and or provide resources for people from different communities, issue areas, and sectors to promote transformative change. I think that many of our officers, many of our employees and soldiers are great at collaboration. We recognize that in our communities, we can't do it all ourselves, so we reach out to other organizations and other people to help us get to the goals that we need to. So I think that in a lot of places, we are already quite collaborative, but I wonder how we can be even more collaborative. How can we be even more collaborative within our DHQs, our THQs? How can we be even more collaborative in our core and crossing these different programs, these different departments, these different silos that we create to be more collaborative? Because when we're more collaborative, we can start seeing where people are falling through the cracks. Health, then, is considering how discrimination and systemic inequality contribute to differing health outcomes and blocks access to healthy food, clean water, and fresh air. This might not seem incredibly pressing to you right now, but we as a Salvation Army work in areas where we go in and help recovery from disasters, or we see people who have lack of access to water. So again, it might not seem like, oh, this is the most important thing, but it is something for us to consider and pay attention to. Where in your work can you start assessing how health might have different levels of oppression within it? Finally, and this is the last thing I'm going to say before we move into some questions, if there are any, is focusing on community. While working in collaboration, we need to highlight the importance of coming together as a community to achieve equal opportunity. Intersectionality recognizes this connection to community and amplifies the importance of assuring that all members of the community are respected and enjoy access to community opportunity. We should strive to include everyone in our fight toward promoting social justice. We are all in the fight together and should develop narratives that ensure that none of us get left behind. Building community and encouraging alliances, coalitions, and looking out for each other will help us solve problems. Intersectionality is not something that you do on your own. It is deeply personal, and it deeply involves inner work for you to gain the empathy to listen to other individuals, but it is something that we must do with one another. It means crossing over into uncomfortable spaces to hear stories that might confront us or challenge us, and it also is a space for healing. We must do this together. We can't solve these problems alone. And certainly, individuals who are facing intersectional oppression are crying out for help and saying, please come alongside me to help alleviate this oppression. Tomorrow, we're going to look at some critiques of intersectionality. We're going to look at some more practical skills, and we're also going to do some recapping and re-explanation of intersectionality if it still wasn't making sense or clicking with you. So I know we have one question of, will the slides be available? I have made them available. I don't know if they will post them. I hope they will post them, and I tried to cite them as rigorously as possible. So if you are interested in where I'm getting these resources from, you'll be able to identify that. Are there any other questions? Great. So I've been so pleased and honored to share this time with you. I'm hoping that this knowledge will encourage you and fortify you in your ministries and in your life and in your family and how you interact with one another. I pray that this will give you a different lens of how you look at the world. And I also pray that it gives you a deeper sense of empathy and connecting with the lowest in our communities, with those who are hurting, with those who are crying out like Rizpah, saying, there is great injustice. Please listen to me. So that is my prayer. I've enjoyed my time with you. I hope that you join us tomorrow.